Gaches. All right, well, thank you for me being allowed to talk here. So I'm going to be talking today about astrochemistry. I am not a chemist by training. I'm actually a physicist, but chemistry touches on what I really do research about, which is the formation of stars. And since then, I've been kind of delving more into chemistry. And even though when I was kind of initially going to college, I ran as fast as I could away from chemistry, it ended up coming back around and hitting me in the face anyways. So one of the kind of general problems that astrochemistry is trying to solve is, in general in the universe, much of the matter is in its atomic form. So this is a map that was created fairly recently by the Hi for Pi group. And what you see there is in colors is the amount of atomic hydrogen. So you see this nice plane, which is the Milky Way. And then you see the blobs kind of in the bottom part, which are the Magellanic Clouds. And there's a lot of atomic hydrogen. But of course, everything in the universe isn't just atomic. So there's this kind of long-standing problem, not only in astrochemistry, but in astronomy in general and in biology, of how you go from this kind of large amount of atomic gas to, well, more terrestrial life. This would be my dog. And so how you go from the atomic gas to the kind of more complicated chemistry and more complicated forms of matter is really an outstanding issue. And so part of the large process now that has linked in with star formation is actually trying to figure out when do you start seeing the building blocks to life starting to form. So I've been talking that not everything is atomic. So what makes up the molecules in the universe? This is what is known as the astronomers' periodic table. As you see, there is many things that are missing from there, largely because we tend to not care as much about them. And they're weighted by how much of it's in the universe. So there's a lot of hydrogen. It dominates. That's what we see most of. In terms of molecules, most of the molecules in the universe are H2, so two hydrogen atoms bonded together. There's helium. Helium is, well, lazy. It doesn't really do much. It doesn't really form molecules, so we can throw that out for the whole talk. Doesn't do anything. And then there's everything else. So the top two are primordial. They're created when the universe was very young, when it was forming. And everything else is in the stars. But if you notice, those little boxes down there, the carbon, the nitrogen, the oxygen, things that are really important to life are really tiny fractions of what constitutes the matter in the universe. So everything that we are, everything in biochemistry and biology is really kind of the trace amounts of matter in the universe. Now, I've been talking about molecules as if they've been known to exist in interstellar space, but this wasn't always the case. If we flash back nearly 100 years by now, there was this outstanding problem where there were some optical observations that were taken, and people saw what's kind of in this bottom corner here, Barnard 68, which is a globule. Let me see if I can get the laser pointer working. There we go. And there were several ideas about what makes these kind of empty spots in space. Now, there wasn't, I think, any mainstream theorists that were talking, ideas that there was actually empty spots in space. But there were several other ideas. One of them, which was a correct idea, was that there's cold dust in these clouds. And the other was that there was these cold clouds full of molecules. And 100 years ago, a very well-known, well-respected astronomer, Sir Arthur Eddington, right here, said that in a famous lecture that it is difficult to admit the existence of molecules in interstellar space. So, and he was the only one. Matter of fact, many of the theorists back then thought that molecules could not exist in space ever. Well, many molecules ended up being found. The least of which were, not even a decade later, was the first detection of a molecule in space, which was CH, followed by cyanide, which was a few years later. But probably the most important detection of a molecule, astronomically, at least up until the point, was of carbon monoxide. And it was in this 1970s paper, and you might recognize two of the names here, Wilson and Penzias. They became very famous for later observations in radio for cosmic microwave background and other. But they detected in 1970 using radio telescopes carbon monoxide towards the Orion Nebula. In the Orion Nebula, you can actually see with a pair of binoculars. If you go out, it's just below the Orion's belt. You can kind of see it as this kind of hazy green cloud. That's the optical part of this. they found CO emission. One of the great things about this paper was that they were very concise. This was their entire abstract of their paper. This would probably not pass referees today, but it's great because you don't even have to read the paper to know what they did. Now this was in 1970. By this point, there was maybe about a dozen molecules that had formed. This is the state of detections now. This was as of actually late February. From this website down here, you can go and look at this website down here, or just Google search it for detected molecules in space. This is the top one that comes up. They keep up a running tab of all the detected molecules, and this is all of them that have been detected in interstellar space. So there's now over 200. Now, when you're looking at this list, there's a few important ones up here. There's H2. H2, which is actually the most numerous molecule, wasn't detected until after carbon monoxide, so it was one of the later ones detected. You see carbon monoxide is somewhere down here. Here it is. You see cyanide, which isn't good for us, but great for space, and many others. But if you look kind of things that are greater than 5 atoms or more, what you might notice if you look at it long enough is that almost everything in there involves carbon and hydrogen. So almost everything that we have detected that it would be considered a complex molecule. And in general, astrochemists define a complex molecule as anything greater than 6 atoms. Talking with chemists, they would consider that to be the simplest atoms, and complexes like 50 or more. So there's a bit of a vocabulary issue sometimes when we try and talk with each other. But for the most part, most of the molecules that we observe in space are organic, or in other words, it's carbon chemistry. So how do we go from these very simple molecules, many of which are particularly bad for us, to the more kind of life-bringing chemistry in terms of the complex molecules over here? Before I go, you can kind of see over here, there's C60, which is a buckyball. Kind of interesting that we've detected that in space now. So in general, the story of how you go from simple to complex, so this is kind of the punchline. So after this, if you want to tune out, you can grab a drink. We go from the very diffuse clouds where you see maybe very simple things. There's carbon monoxide here. As gravity starts to take over, the cloud starts to collapse, starts to get more dense. When it gets more dense, things are able to form more complicated molecules. So you see kind of a more complicated molecule here. This looks like formaldehyde or H2CO. You see water here. Now within these dense clouds, you have stars forming. And in fact, the main way that we trace star formation is by the emission of molecules in these regions. And when stars form, they form these large accretion disks. And within these large accretion disks, you can form more exotic molecules, more complicated molecules, and you can actually start to form prebiotic molecules, or things that are the buildup towards life. Now, this is a very simple picture. In general, what does this look like? When we look at the Milky Way and carbon monoxide line, so this was in 2001, so 2001 down here, so 30 years after the first detection. This was a very large map that was taken using a single dish telescope of the carbon monoxide emission in the Milky Way. So there's a lot of carbon monoxide in the Milky Way. In general, anywhere you look along the disk, you're going to have carbon monoxide emission. In fact, CO is so important in astronomy that almost every single one of the carbon monoxide lines is allocated within the US radio bandwidths, so people can't actually broadcast radios or anything in the military or normal life within these bands. So they've actually been protected for astronomy usage because these lines are so important. Now this is the whole Milky Way, and if you look over here, there's this kind of little clump over here. These are the Orion clouds, and so the Orion Nebula is actually somewhere right around here. So I'm going to zoom into there. We can zoom in. This is again carbon monoxide emission within the Orion Nebula, and they've very nicely drawn over the constellation here. And so the visible nebula that you can see is kind of somewhere around here. This is where you have a large group of high mass stars, and then the Orion complex is split into 2 groups. So there's the Orion A group down here, and the Orion B cloud, which is up here. So I'm going to zoom in even further on this Orion B cloud. And this is what the same cloud looks like and 13 CO. So it's CO with one more neutron atom added onto it. So it's 13 CO. This is nice. It's a little bit less abundant than normal CO, so we can see a bit further into the cloud for various reasons. But I want to note that this is about 15 light years across. So the carbon monoxide is really tracing very large scales of the cloud. Now, when we build up from simple molecules to more complex, you start to see what these kind of scales trace. So we can go one step more complex, and that's hydrogen cyanide, or HCN. Again, another chemical that is not very good for humans, but you can see it starts tracing much more smaller scales all of a sudden. So what this tells you, astrochemists, is that this molecule only forms in areas that are more dense, and that it tends to be destroyed much more easily than carbon monoxide. If it wasn't destroyed as easily, you would see it everywhere. So this tells us a little bit about the chemistry. We can go one step more complex and go to this molecule N2H+. This is nowadays one of the powerhouse molecules that's used in star formation. It's in almost every single survey. They use N2H+ or one of its other forms. But you see a stark contrast between these. So once you go to a significantly more complex molecule, where it's being traced is in very small areas. So this again tells you where, the conditions that you see these things starting to form. Now, I mentioned before that there's a lot of organic molecules, a lot of organic chemistry. So luckily this survey looked at a very important organic molecule, which is methanol, or CH3OH. And it, again, traces very, very small, compact regions. So this tells you that organic molecules are very easily destroyed, and they only form in areas that are kind of similar to these regions in the sky. So astrochemists can go and they can look at a huge amount of these molecules, and they can try and model the chemistry to figure out, actually, instead of just looking at it in terms of astronomy, what can you learn from the chemistry? So there's professional chemists now that are actually using radio instruments from astronomy to measure things about chemistry. Now, we can go even more complex than methanol and look at this molecule called formamide. This is a very important molecule for life. In fact, formamide sits kind of in the center of almost everything that we need for life. So you have amino acids, you have your sugars, your nucleic acid bases, and what terrestrial experiments have shown is that formamide, with given enough energy, can actually start to rapidly form all of these things. So when this was found out in terrestrial experiments, there was a huge amount of effort that said, well, can we see this in space? Because if we can see formamide in space, that would tell us that the building blocks to life are into space before we even have the formation of planets, which would be a really huge thing for the origin of life. Now, luckily, formamide sits in the range of a lot of telescopes. And so this is now zoomed in on a very small region of a cloud. So now this is about 1,000 AU. So much smaller than the previous ones. And all of these observations here are of complex organic molecules. Formamide is here in the red box. You have acetic acid over here, and methanol. And what's apparent is that there's a lot of formamide. So even before you get the formation of a star, in this case, before you get the formation of planets, you have the building blocks to life just sitting there in space. Now this puts a huge initial condition, a very important one, on trying to understand where life begins. Does life begin purely on planets, or can you start to have the building blocks to life, such as sugars or nucleic bases? Can you start to form those in space before you even have planets? Now, organics can be very nice for trying to solve this problem, and if you try and target the organic molecules very specifically to take maps, it's very nice. Unfortunately, organic molecules can also be a bit of a troublemaker for astronomers as well. And instead of looking at maps, if we look at a line survey, so if instead of trying to actually map spatially where all this emission is coming, if you just take a single dish telescope and you point it at a region and you collect as much light of it as possible in the radio regime, what do you see? It looks something like this. Now, each one of Now they've kind of annotated some important lines here. None of these are very complicated molecules. You see organics for formaldehyde here. But almost every one of these other lines here, and there's thousands of them in this data set. This is actually only a small snippet of the data. This data isn't just from 341 to 350. It actually covers about 100 gigahertz of space. Almost every single one of these lines is an organic molecule, and the vast majority of these are complicated organic molecules. So while this can be great if you're trying to study organic molecules, if you're trying to study something like carbon monoxide, and your line sits and it's flooded now by hundreds of other molecules, you have a problem. So organics are nice, but if you're trying to actually sometimes study physics from these line surveys, they can be a bit of a troublemaker because there's just too many organics. And so you end up having a huge data problem. There was a line survey like this taken over a decade ago, and as of 2 years ago, they had only identified 25% of the lines in a decade of time. So it's now a huge data science problem of how you actually identify all these lines. People are now trying to use machine learning to do this because there's just too many. Now, most of the chemistry I've talked about before exists only in the gas phase. So, two molecules interact with each other and something happens. But there's a large debate now of whether or not complex organics form in the gas or in ices. So when I talk about ice, what do I mean? Let's see if this plays. So this video, if it plays, let's see. Yeah, so the gray that you saw there was a kind of spherical carbon dust grain, kind of similar actually to the dust grains and the kind of stuff that gets exuded from your exhaust pipe. And all of these other things that are being built upon it is water. So this is just showing how water ice builds up in space. And it doesn't form up in this nice spherical nature. It actually forms these kind of fluffy ice mantles, and there's a lot of ice. And the benefit of ice is that now things are put to be very compact. They're close to each other. So now things that might not be able to occur in the gas phase can occur on the dust grains because they're sitting right next to each other. So I'll show you, this is a cross section of this same video. That kind of spherical dust grain, which was pure carbon, is sitting here, and everything else is water ice. So the vast majority of the size of a dust grain in these cold regions of space is almost all ice. And within these ices, you can have organic molecules start to form. Now, so far I've shown you kind of large-scale clouds, but what about something a bit more small-scale, something that we might be a bit more familiar with? So this is a comet that the Rosetta lander recently went to. This is a nice image of it. You see these gas vapors coming off of it, and they actually detected glycine. And glycine is a very important molecule for life. They detected glycine on the comet. So this is one of the most important molecules for life, just sitting on a comet. And this helps you try and figure out, did life originally form on Earth, or was the seeds of life actually brought to Earth by other things? And they didn't just detect glycine, they detected phosphorus, and phosphorus also is important. Phosphorus tags on a lot of your things like DNA. So finally, I'm going to kind of finish up with this headline that hit trending, and it's been showing up about every 2 years now. I found this same headline in 2012, 2014, and 2016. Basically, every time astronomers detect methyl formate or ethyl formate, a headline like this starts to show up all over the place. So it's galaxy centers, tastes of raspberries and smells of rum, says astronomers. Now, I could not find a paper that actually said this. It turns out all these headlines are based off of a quote that was brought about within this paper where they asked what's so important about this molecule, and one of the quotes was saying, oh, well, this molecule also happens to give the smell for raspberries, and they just went with it. Now, I've shown you that a lot of the maps and a lot of the things show a lot of carbon monoxide, a lot of ammonia, a lot of methane and methanol. So if we try and actually put everything to scale in terms of what molecules are there, we might be able to actually figure out what the galaxy center could smell like if we put everything to scale. So, well, let's go with our headline of raspberries and rum. So we'll put in our raspberries and rum down here. Now, as I mentioned, most of the molecules are in the form of hydrogen, or H2, and helium, which kind of does nothing, but still there. So we'll represent that as balloons. Although, warning to anyone, hydrogen balloons are not a good idea. Now, everything else was things like carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and ammonia. So we're going to represent that basically as a dump with some nice vapors going off it to represent the ammonia. If you have cats and you wonder why your litter box smells really badly, you can blame ammonia for that. And that's just in one corner of your house. Imagine if it was throughout your whole house. Now, there's a lot of other things like PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are kind of small chains of carbon atoms. There's a lot of carbon dioxide and ethanol and all sorts of horrible things like that. So we'll represent that as a car. But I think that this shows the true optimism of journalism when you look at this scene and you go, well, this must smell like raspberries and rum. So this is kind of a nice pictograph of what the molecules in space are actually like, and what the environments of these clouds would actually be like. So even though they're incredibly important for us, and it's from these regions that stars form and planets, we probably wouldn't like it as much as if you go to a dump. So it's about the same. Thank you so much for allowing me to have this talk. I'll give it over to Raquel here, or for any questions.
Thank you, Bond, Carbon Bond. We have some time for some questions. Yes, sir. In the middle.
Talk about it as a gas cloud, but how dense is that really?
Yeah, so the question was, how dense are the gas clouds? In general, these clouds tend to have a densities between around 1,000 to 10,000 particles per cubic centimeter. That's incredibly dense for space, but even to this day, the best vacuums on Earth, as far as I know, still cannot reach these densities. But they're still incredibly dense by space.
Sir, in the back, right there.
A lot of the molecules that you showed in the list of 200 seemed exotic, like the ones that might not be stable on Earth. So what allows them to be stable in space?
Yeah, so the question was, a lot of the molecules on the list would be considered exotic by terrestrial terms, and they're not stable on Earth, and what allows them to exist in space. A lot of that is just a condition. So even though it's dense for space, it's not very dense in terms of terrestrial standards, and it's cold. So the temperature of this class tend to be around 10 to 30 degrees Kelvin, so 10 to 30 degrees above absolute zero. And in fact, I thought these molecules were common until I went to a chemistry talk by an astrochemist, and the whole audience laughed when he showed those. But because of the fact that these are very exotic molecules, people are now taking these observations to actually try and learn something about the chemistry. So because it's so low density terrestrial and so cold, it's really in the far limit of quantum chemistry.
Sir, standing in the back.
How does the composition of interstellar molecules differ from the composition of the stars? And how does that composition differ from the composition of molecules from planets? Why do planets look different from the stars?
Okay, so the question was about the composition of molecules. Why is it different from space to the sun, and space to the planets? So in terms of from the star to the rest of the cloud, in general, for instance, how many metals are in the star is traced very well by the cloud that it came from. However, for instance, if you take our sun's had 4 billion years of processing. It's had contaminations as it's gone about its orbit. So that's tended to be why you have some differences. In terms of it from planets, you still have a lot of processing. So for instance, deuterium gets added into the chemistry, but because there's various barriers in there, you see different amounts of deuterium in comets versus planets, or in our own sun spectrum versus the other planets. So it's largely due to when it was formed and how much processing happens between those times.
Okay, last question right here.
So you mentioned interstellar dust briefly at first, like it was something other than molecules. And I don't think it's like dust bunnies, but what is the chemical composition of dust in this phenomenon?
So the question was about the chemical composition of dust and what is it. So there's basically two kind of different kinds of dust. There's silicates and carbon-based dust grains. Carbon-based dust grains are very much so just like soot. So it's just carbon, you know, you can almost think of like carbon ash, or, you know, kind of much more, you know, like sheets of graphite. The silicates, you know, you have a lot of things like oxide, so even, you know, things that are kind of somewhat similar to, you know, kind of sand grains. So it is still just carbon, and so it's things that are still, you know, familiar with terrestrial base examples. And in fact, some of our best samples of dust grains come from just the upper atmosphere of the Earth.
Okay, great. So let's thank Carbon Bond again.